On the kind of scorching afternoon when even shadows tremble, Zuri opens her door to a starving young musician whose eyes burn with a hunger far deeper than food. A hunger she cannot name, but instantly fears. Something in his presence presses against her spirit like an unspoken prophecy, a quiet warning wrapped inside a fragile smile. And as she steps aside to let him into her home, unaware that fate is watching her choice with a silent, breathless interest, the first spark of a betrayal she cannot yet imagine begins to breathe in the corner of her kindness. Kalen enters her courtyard with slow, deliberate movements, his body weak, but his gaze strangely focused, as though he is mapping the space even while pretending to admire its warmth. Zuri guides him to the wooden bench beneath the acacia tree, the one her late father carved years ago when life felt simpler. She brings him water first, watching the relief cascading through his body with every sip. He drinks like someone who has walked too far and trusted too little, and in that simple act, something in Zuri softens. She recognizes the language of exhaustion. She has seen it on her own face more times than she cares to remember. But beneath his trembling gratitude, she feels a quiet tension radiating from him, a weight that whispers he carries more than just hunger. When he speaks, his voice surprises her, soft but sharp, tired yet filled with ambition. He tells her he is a guitarist traveling from village to village, chasing stages that always feel just one chance away. The city agents he sought never showed, the crowds he longed for never formed, and the dreams he carried felt heavier each time he failed to outrun despair. Yet there is a conviction in his eyes, a ferocity wrapped inside elegance that makes Zuri believe he is someone who refuses to collapse, even when standing hurts. She listens, her empathy rising like warm tidewater, unaware that her gentle silence is giving him more space than she intended. She brings him food, soft ugali, grilled tilapia, slices of ripe mango, and watches him eat. He eats politely at first, then with the urgency of someone who has not felt full in too long. Zuri sees gratitude in the way he holds the spoon, but she also notices something else, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he studies the room, the way he glances at shelves, corners, and doorways. He is taking in everything, cataloging it quietly. She wonders what he sees, a humble home patched with memories, pottery stacked in gentle rows, clay dust softening the floor like scattered ashes of effort. But Kalen sees more. He sees stability, structure, safety, things he has never held for long. As the evening stretches, she introduces him to her workshop. The scent of clay greets them, earthy and warm, mixing with the soft hum of the cooling kiln. Zuri shows him her bowls etched with ancestral stories, vases shaped with figurines, the quiet triumphs of everyday people. Kalen touches each one lightly, not with appreciation, but with calculation, though he masks it well behind a practiced smile. Zuri mistakes his interest for inspiration, unaware that his admiration is not for the craft itself, but for what it could represent if placed in the right hands, or sold to the right eyes. Over the next few days, he becomes a quiet echo in her home. He wakes before sunrise, sits by her fire, plays soft melodies that stretch like threads across the air. Villagers pass by and pause to listen, charmed by the sweetness in his voice and the humility he wears like a borrowed coat. Zuri begins to trust the rhythm they form together, believing their meeting was a gentle intersection of two wandering paths. She sees only the softness in him, not the quiet hunger tightening behind his calm expressions. She sees only potential, never noticing how deeply he watches her every move. But Kalen feels the boundaries shifting. He feels the safety of her home, the warmth of her routines, the softness of a life that could hold him if he chose to stay. And yet, ambition pulses through him, like a river that refuses to sleep. He wants more than comfort. He wants the world. And when desire and opportunity stand too close, temptation grows like a shadow no one notices until it moves. One night, after Zuri falls asleep with the softness of someone who trusts too easily, Kalen rises from his bed with a quiet urgency that does not belong to gratitude. The moon stretches silver across the workshop walls as he enters, drawn by a pull he no longer tries to resist. Shelves glow faintly in the light, rows of finished pottery, each one shaped by Zuri's skill and patience. But Kalen's eyes drift past them toward something else, something half hidden beneath a folded cloth. There, resting in the pale moonlight, lies an ancient wooden box engraved with symbols he has never seen, heavy, secretive, and beckoning him with the silent promise of something that doesn't belong to him. And as his fingers move closer, the night seems to hold its breath, waiting to see which part of his soul will answer. The first time Kalen steps onto a makeshift stage, his voice shakes so violently that even he doubts it will survive the first note. Yet when the trembling sound escapes him, the crowd freezes as if struck by something ancient and electrifying. In that charged stillness, Kalen feels fame brush against him like a warm, forbidden breath, awakening a longing he has spent his entire life pretending he didn't crave. And as the applause rises like a tidal wave, Zuri watches with a tightening heart, sensing that the world is noticing him far faster and far darker than he is prepared to handle. The afternoon sun dips behind the marketplace roofs, casting long streaks of gold and amber across the open square. The air smells of roasted maize, dust, and distant rain, but the crowd is no longer paying attention to any of it. Their eyes are locked on Kalen as though he has become something rare, something luminous, something that does not belong to the ordinary rhythm of village life. His voice, despite its imperfections, carries a rawness that feels startlingly familiar to their own buried hopes. It quivers, then steadies, then rises with a fragile confidence, drawing people closer until the entire square pulses around him like a single shared heartbeat. Even Kalen seems stunned by the sound pouring out of him. He stares at the crowd with widening eyes, almost afraid to accept what he sees. Recognition. It is not the shallow praise he received from strangers when desperation forced him to perform in bus stations. This is something deeper, something that reflects him back to himself in a way that makes his chest tighten. With every note, he feels the ground beneath him shift, as though destiny has finally turned its head in his direction. Zuri stands at the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped against her skirt, her lips curved into a quiet, proud smile. She remembers the day he sat under her acacia tree, exhausted and nameless, his guitar rattling like loose bones inside a broken case. She remembers the tremble in his voice when he spoke of dreams that felt too big to say aloud. Watching him now, she feels something soft rise inside her, a quiet triumph, a tender joy. She has always believed the world grows brighter when someone finally steps into the light they were meant to carry. But she also feels something else, a flicker of unease beneath the joy. She sees how his eyes change when the crowd cheers, how ambition sharpens, how hunger deepens, how he stands straighter, almost as if applause is oxygen. She notices how he scans he starts to dress, carrying him, lifts him too quickly. But the scouts arrive before she can. They come dressed in city fabric, speaking in polished tones, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and distant places. They stand near his stage, with crossed arms and analytical eyes, observing him as if he is something to be measured, not cherished. Their smiles are practiced, their compliments smooth, and their promises polished like stones tossed in a river. They whisper about studios, travel, contracts, fame, and futures too big for the village to contain. And each word wraps around Kalen like silk threaded with poison. Zuri watches him absorb their flattery with an eagerness that unsettles her. She hears the tremor in his laughter, senses the shift in his posture, sees how he leans toward the very people who view him as a product rather than a person. She wants to pull him back, to anchor him before he drifts into a world that values brilliance only until it finds the next star. But she says nothing, because she refuses to dim the joy he feels, even if it frightens her. Late one evening, after a performance that draws the largest crowd yet, a well-known producer steps close to Kalen. He studies him with a predator's patience, smiles with a charm too smooth to trust, and leans in just enough for only Kalen to hear him. When the producer whispers, "Prove you are hungry enough," Kalen freezes, not in confusion, but in a terrifying recognition. Because at that moment, he knows exactly what the price of his rise will be. And the whispered cost carries Zuri's name. Kalen returns to Zuri's home with a tender smile that hides a storm behind his eyes. A smile too carefully shaped to belong to the boy she once found trembling on her doorstep. His voice is warm when he calls her name, his embrace gentle, yet beneath his calm exterior lies a restless pulse, a shifting urgency that he hopes she will mistake for excitement rather than fear. Zuri welcomes him as she always has, with open arms, soft laughter, and the same unwavering belief that he is still the dreamer she promised to protect. She has no idea he is standing at the edge of a decision that will cut through her deepest trust, leaving wounds she will spend years trying to understand. He sits at her table, eating her food, praising her cooking, speaking of crowded marketplaces and new admirers as though he is trying to stitch her into his rise. Zuri listens, smiling with the quiet pride of someone who expects nothing in return for the love she gives. She notices the brightness in his eyes, the trembling in his fingers, the way he glances toward her workshop door as though something behind it calls to him more urgently than her words. She takes these signs as excitement, as youthful impatience, never imagining they are symptoms of growing hunger. Hunger not for food, but for the next step toward fame, the one he cannot take alone. And there, resting in her workshop, lies the inheritance she guards more fiercely than any possession, her grandmother's ancestral healing manuscript. It is a fragile hand-stitched book passed from woman to woman, filled with centuries of remedies, blessings, poetic teachings, and spiritual reflections that have guided her family through triumph and loss. Zuri keeps it wrapped in a cloth embroidered with her grandmother's initials, stored in a wooden box her father carved long before he died. She opens it only on days when she feels her spirit drifting or her purpose clouded. It is her legacy, her grounding, her compass. Kalen, however, sees something different, a symbol of history, mystique, depth, and cultural power that talent scouts in the city crave more than authenticity itself. One producer in particular told him, "People rise faster when their stories feel ancient. Bring us something no one else carries." Kalen heard those words as if they were a command written into his bones. And here, in Zuri's home, sits the one thing capable of transforming him from mere performer into a sensation the world cannot look away from. Later that night, after Zuri drifts into the kind of sleep reserved for hearts that have loved too generously, Kalen walks into her workshop with slow, deliberate steps. The moon paints faint patterns across the walls, softening the sharpness of his intentions. He kneels beside the wooden box and lifts the cloth as though lifting her heartbeat. The manuscript's pages release a faint scent of dried herbs and aged ink, threads binding stories his hands have no right to touch. But he touches them anyway. The book feels warm, alive, almost breathing. For a moment, guilt flickers through him, a tremor of conscience shaped by every kindness she gave him, but ambition swallows it whole. He slips the manuscript into his guitar case, hiding it beneath the broken strings and worn fabric. He closes the case carefully, then stands in the dim light, breathing heavily as if he has crossed a line he cannot step back from. He tells himself it is temporary. He tells himself he will return it. He tells himself Zuri is strong enough to forgive him once he explains. But deep down, he knows forgiveness will not erase what he has just taken, not the object, not the trust, not the legacy. When dawn arrives, Zuri wakes with a warmth in her chest, unaware that her world is already shifting beneath her. She prepares breakfast and calls Kalen's name, expecting him to appear with sleepy gratitude and soft laughter. Instead, His room is empty. The bed untouched. His guitar case gone. A sharp, instinctive dread tightens her breath as she rushes to her workshop. And when she sees the wooden box open, the cloth pushed aside, and the manuscript missing, her knees weaken beneath the weight of betrayal. The air feels colder, the silence heavier, and for the first time since her father's passing, she feels abandoned by the very world she has tried so hard to trust. Her heart cracks open quietly, without noise, the way heartbreak often arrives, slow, deliberate, and merciless in its timing. She sinks to the floor, pressing her hands to her chest, trying to understand how a smile could hide such a wound. But there is no answer waiting for her. Only absence, only emptiness, only the echo of a promise she never asked him to make. Meanwhile, in the city miles away, Kalen steps onto a glittering stage for the first time. Blinding lights wash over him. Applause rolls like thunder. Success rises around him with intoxicating force. Yet beneath all the noise, something presses against his ribs. A hollow ache, a burning absence that refuses to quiet. And as he stands beneath the lights that were supposed to complete him, the applause feels like smoke, thin and unsatisfying. For in the space where triumph should live, he feels only the weight of what he stole, and the haunting truth that Zuri's absence is louder than any crowd that will ever cheer his name. Kalen becomes the rising star of the nation, but every spotlight feels like fire pressed against wounds he refuses to name. The roar of crowds swallows him whole night after night, yet inside his chest, something fragile trembles, begging for breath. Success wraps itself around him with the warmth of victory, but the taste turns bitter the moment applause fades, because beneath every note he sings, guilt coils like a parasite, feeding on the sweetness he cannot enjoy. The world celebrates him as the boy who rose from dust to destiny, but he alone knows the truth. The foundation of his fame was built on something stolen from the only woman who ever sheltered him without asking for anything in return. He tries to bury the ache beneath the noise. Endless noise. Interviews where he shapes his story with the ease of a practiced liar, describing inspiration instead of theft. Parties filled with music loud enough to drown the heartbeat he no longer wants to hear. Greeting lines where fans clutch his hands, praise his brilliance, and tell him he saved their darkest nights. Words he once longed for, but now accepts with a smile that feels like peeling skin. Every room he enters echoes with admiration, yet he senses a distance in the way it lands on him, as though the world embraces a version of him he cannot fully claim. The manuscript he stole becomes his silent companion, sealed in a secure case backstage at every show. Producers praise the ancestral depth in his lyrics, the authenticity that feels ancient, spiritual, alive. They call him a phenomenon, a rare voice, a once-in-a-generation star. He nods, gives interviews about his creative process, and pretends he crafted everything through pure talent. But late at night, when lights dim and crowds scatter, he feels the weight of the manuscript pressing against him like a ghost leaning over his shoulder, whispering a reminder that none of this truly belongs to him. Fans adore him with a devotion that startles even the most seasoned promoters. Cities sell out, stadiums, streets fill with chants of his name. Murals painted in his honor stretch across alley walls. Cameras follow him like moths circling a flame, capturing every detail of his life, his outfits, his laughter, his tears, his triumphs. Yet the more the world embraces him, the more he feels loneliness gnawing at the edges of his spirit. At night, in hotel rooms lined with luxury and emptiness, he lies awake, listening to the mechanical hum of air conditioners, imagining how Zuri might have reacted to his success if she had witnessed it from a place of pride instead of heartbreak. But pride requires truth, and he stole the truth from her. Every achievement becomes a lie stitched with stolen threads. Every award feels like a borrowed crown. Every song he releases echoes with a hollowness he tries desperately to ignore. He smiles for cameras, but the smile never reaches his soul. He bows before crowds, but his heart sinks deeper each time. He signs autographs with a flourish, but every stroke of his pen feels like carving deception into paper. The world thinks he is living a dream, but he is living inside a cage made of gold, a cage whose bars shine so brightly that even he sometimes forgets they are trapping him. When he walks through backstage corridors after his performances, he feels whispers trailing behind him, not from people, but from the guilt that refuses to die. Zuri's face flashes in his memory, her gentle eyes, her steady hands shaping clay, her voice offering him a home when he deserved none. He remembers waking under her roof, hearing her hum softly as she boiled herbs in her grandmother's clay pot. He remembers the warmth of belonging, something fame cannot manufacture. These memories cling to him like vines, pulling him back to a truth he ran from. And yet, he continues performing as though the spotlight has the power to erase his past. He convinces himself that if he keeps singing loudly enough, the silence of his guilt will never catch him. But guilt is not silence. It is a whisper that grows teeth. One night, after a sold-out concert in a stadium so loud it trembles beneath his feet, Kalen steps outside for air. The city lights shimmer around him, cameras flash in the distance, and fans shout his name as security struggles to hold the barriers. He breathes in deeply, trying to steady the uneven rhythm of his chest. But then, in the shifting glow of the street lamps, he notices a figure standing motionless near the back entrance. Hooded, still, almost blending into the darkness. Kalen slows, then stops entirely. Something in the figure's posture strikes a chord in his memory, though he cannot place it. The stadium noise grows distant, muffled by the tension tightening inside him. The figure lifts a hand, holding something small, wrapped in cloth. With a voice barely above a whisper, the stranger calls his name, and when the figure steps forward, the cloth unfolds, revealing a message that slices through the walls, has built around his guilt, a message carrying the one truth he has feared more than losing fame. Zuri knows. The messenger's warning hits Kalen like a blade carved from truth. Zuri's stolen manuscript has slipped into the hands of men who see tradition only as currency, not responsibility. In a single breath, he realizes the betrayal he once justified as ambition has grown into something monstrous, something that now harms people who never even knew his name. The fame that once tasted sweet now curdles into something metallic on his tongue, and the applause he adored becomes nothing more than noise, drowning out the quiet collapse of the world he wronged. The messenger, an elderly traveler with dust woven into the seams of his cloak, sits across from Kalen in the shadows behind the stadium. His voice is low, steady, and stripped of the softness most people use when speaking to celebrities. He tells Kalen that the ancestral teachings Zuri inherited, teachings meant to heal, have been twisted into shallow performances sold at markets by men claiming to be chosen by spirits. They recite her remedies with careless tongues, promising miracles they do not understand, charging desperate families for rituals that were never meant to be touched by greed. And the land, wounded by their ignorance, has begun to respond in ways that frighten even the oldest villagers. Kalen listens, stiffening as shame sneaks beneath his ribs. The messenger describes rural communities where illnesses spread after counterfeit healers misapply Zuri's rituals, where children grow weaker from salves prepared incorrectly, where families blame ancient spirits for their suffering, because no one dares blame the men exploiting tradition. Kalen's breath falters as he imagines Zuri's teachings she protected more fiercely than her own comfort, now corrupted, performed by hands that neither honor nor understand the responsibility carved into each line. Her wisdom was never meant to be commercialized. Her legacy was never meant to be spectacle. He feels something inside him collapse deeper than guilt. It is not just regret. It is decay. a slow, crumbling rot that creeps through his soul as he remembers Zuri's gentle smile when she first invited him into her home, the warmth of her voice as she whispered prayers over herbal mixtures, the cautious reverence in her hands as she touched the manuscript's pages. He had stolen her inheritance, but the world had gone further. They had stolen her dignity, her purpose, and the sacred balance her ancestors entrusted to her. The messenger continues, describing villages where fear grows like vines. People whisper that spirits have abandoned them. They say rituals have lost their power. They say the land is angry. In the cracks of those rumors, Kalen hears his own name, unspoken but undeniable. He hides his trembling hands beneath the table, unable to escape the truth that his ambition didn't just break one woman's life. It fractured an entire chain of history. For the first time since fame consumed him, silence feels heavier than applause. He remembers the producer who pushed him to prove he was hungry enough, the night he convinced himself that stealing Zuri's manuscript was simply part of the journey. But now, surrounded by shadows, he realizes he wasn't proving hunger. He was feeding greed. The price he paid for fame is far smaller than the price others are paying for his betrayal. The messenger studies him closely, as though measuring whether remorse has finally rooted itself deep enough to matter. Kalen tries to speak, tries to form the apology he owes to a world he wounded. But words falter, caught somewhere between his chest and his tongue. Instead, he asks the only question that matters. Where is she now? The messenger's expression shifts, softening in a way that feels both merciful and heartbreaking. He tells Kalen that after losing her manuscript, Zuri's world collapsed quietly. Her practice, once respected by nearby communities, began to crumble as people questioned the authenticity of her remaining knowledge. She was blamed for rituals performed incorrectly by imposters. Those who once sought her healing began to doubt her, and the weight of humiliation, carried in silence, pushed her to vanish before anyone could watch her break. Kalen's breath tightens painfully as the messenger reveals that she did not disappear out of anger, but out of exhaustion. She walked barefoot across landscapes that swallowed her footprints, carrying nothing but the shards of her dignity. She sought solitude far beyond cities and villages, far beyond the places where her name could be misused, far beyond the reach of fame's echo. She went somewhere only those who have tasted deep betrayal choose to go, a place where no one can touch what remains of them. Kalen feels a coldness settle under his skin. The thought of Zuri wandering alone, while he stood beneath blinding lights, feels unbearable. He imagines her sitting near a riverbank, whispering apologies to ancestors for something she never caused. He imagines her resting beneath acacia trees, with nothing but silence to warm her nights. And he imagines her choosing isolation not because she lacked strength, but because the world around her lacked fairness. The messenger leans closer, his eyes filled with a truth Kalen is almost too afraid to hear. He whispers the place where Zuri was last seen, a destination untouched by roads or recognition. And as the name slices softly through the night air, Kalen realizes he must face the one place fame will never follow him, and the one woman he is no longer sure will welcome him back. Kalen abandons the glittering stage as if it were a burning house collapsing behind him, fleeing through the back door while the crowd still chants his name. The desert air outside hits him with the force of a confession, dry and merciless, stripping away the illusion of fame he once clung to. He begins walking, not toward another concert, not toward another interview, but toward the ghosts he created. Every step slices deeper into his conscience, carving out the truth he spent years avoiding. And as he crosses the first dusty road leading away from the city, he feels something he has not felt in years: fear of himself. The first village greets him with quiet suspicion, its residents gathered around a makeshift fire where evening stories are told. Kalen lowers his hood, expecting scorn, expecting someone to recognize the man whose songs echo across radios. But no one cares for fame here. Their eyes are not drawn to his face. They are drawn to the pain he carries like a wound stitched poorly beneath his ribs. An elderly woman steps forward, her gaze sharp, yet softened by memory. She asks if he seeks medicine or prayer. When he answers no, when he whispers that he seeks Zuri, her expression transforms into something distant and heavy. She begins to speak of Zuri not as a healer, but as a daughter of the earth. She describes how Zuri once stayed in their village for 7 days, tending to a fever outbreak that threatened their children. She recalls how Zuri mixed herbs through the night, chanting old remedies passed down through generations. She remembers the calm that settled across the community, not when the sickness ended, but when Zuri arrived, because her presence alone felt like the promise of dawn. Kalen listens, each word cutting through him like a truth he does not deserve to hear. The woman ends her story with a quiet blessing for Zuri's soul, and a silence that refuses to acknowledge the man who brought her suffering. The second village receives him with warm hospitality, unaware of who he truly is. Children run barefoot through dusty paths, stopping only when Kalen asks if they remember a young healer with soft eyes and a woven satchel. Their faces brighten instantly. They speak of Zuri as though she were a legend more than a person. They describe how she once taught them songs to calm their fears during a drought, melodies meant to remind them that rivers remember their way home. They sing a fragment of those songs for him, gentle harmonies rising into the air like echoes of innocence, and Kalen feels his throat tighten with grief he can no longer swallow. He walks away before the song ends. His guilt will not allow him to stay. The third village is harder. The people here know him. His music plays from old radios. His face appears on posters tacked onto crumbling walls. But instead of excitement, he meets disappointment wrapped in familiarity. They had followed his rise, believing him to be a symbol of possibility. Yet when he asks about Zuri, the mood shifts. A man with calloused hands steps forward and tells Kalen that Zuri came here after her manuscript was stolen. She arrived quiet, thin, but determined to restore whatever fragments of her legacy remained. She helped a child walk again, soothed a widow's grief, and planted seeds in barren soil until life found a way to grow. But she never smiled fully. Not once. Kalen flinches. He tries to hide the tremor in his voice as he asks what happened to her afterward. The man hesitates, exchanging glances with the villagers. They explain that on a night when the moon hung low and red, Zuri packed her satchel and walked away, telling no one where she was going. Her footsteps followed a path toward the hills, toward the deeper lands untouched by roads, untouched by greed. Rumors spread that she was searching for a place where her ancestors' voices still whispered clearly, somewhere far from the noise of human suffering. Kalen moves on, driven by a desperation that grows heavier with each step. Days blur into nights. Nights blur into aching miles. The sand coats his throat. The sun scorches his guilt, and the silence around him grows thick with the memories he is forced to confront. He meets mothers who speak of Zuri's gentle hands. He meets elders who still bless her name before they eat. He meets young boys she once taught to read, who now send prayers into the wind, hoping she can hear them. With every story, Kalen realizes he didn't just betray her. He betrayed every life she touched, every community she uplifted, every ancestor whose wisdom she carried with reverence. By the time he reaches the final village, a settlement perched at the edge of dense wilderness, his legs barely carry him. The chief meets him with a solemn expression, studying the man who arrives with exhaustion in his bones and regret in his eyes. When Kalen asks for Zuri, the chief sighs deeply, his gaze drifting toward the dark silhouette beyond the tree line. He tells Kalen that after her final heartbreak, Zuri walked into the sacred forest, a place no one enters unless they seek either rebirth or reckoning. The chief leans closer, lowering his voice as though the trees themselves are listening. He whispers that those who enter the sacred forest return only if their spirit is strong enough to face the truth waiting inside. And as Kalen turns toward its shadowed path, he realizes this road may not lead to forgiveness, but to the deepest confrontation of his life. The sacred forest rose before Kalen like a breathing creature, vast, ancient, and impossibly still, as though every leaf were holding the memory of 1,000 unspoken stories. The air thickened the moment he stepped toward its boundary, carrying the weight of spirits that tasted like the way fire tastes air. A shiver ran through him, not from cold, but from recognition. This place did not welcome humans. It revealed them. And as Kalen crossed into its shadowed threshold, trembling with a fear he could not surrender, he knew the forest would unearth everything he had buried beneath ambition, guilt, and regret. The moment his foot touched the moss-covered ground, a rustle echoed through the trees, too synchronized to be wind. Branches shifted as though bending to inspect him. The deeper he walked, the heavier the air became, pressing against his chest with a quiet force that felt like judgment. He tried to breathe steadily, but every inhale felt filtered through the spirits surrounding him, spirits that had walked with Zuri long before he ever knew her name. He could feel their gaze, ancient and unblinking, tracing the cracks in his soul. Then the first vision came. It struck without warning, sudden, sharp, and unbearably clear. He saw himself standing in Zuri's small home, her ancestral manuscript in his hands, the dim lamplight catching the guilt in his eyes before he smothered it with ambition. The vision replayed in agonizing detail, the trembling of his fingers, the whisper of paper against cloth, the moment he convinced himself he was taking what he deserved. He staggered back, gripping a tree trunk as though it could anchor him. But the forest was not finished. More shadows gathered, circling him in slow, deliberate movements. They whispered in voices made of wind and memory, weaving fragments of truths he had tried to escape. He heard Zuri's quiet laughter, soft like water over stones. He heard her gratitude the day he first arrived, unaware she was welcoming heartbreak into her home. He heard the way her voice broke when she discovered her legacy gone. The whispers twined around him until his knees buckled beneath the weight of everything he had done. The forest dimmed, its light fading into a murky twilight that seemed to breathe with his regret. When he opened his eyes, another vision unfolded. This one, even harder to bear. He saw Zuri standing alone by the riverbank months after he had betrayed her, her shoulders curled inward, her hands clutching the empty space where her manuscript once rested. She looked thinner, quieter, a woman carrying pain without blame. She lifted her face toward the sky, whispering prayers for strength. Never curses for him. That gentleness crushed him more than any punishment the spirits could offer. His breath shook violently. He pressed his palms against his face, feeling the forest press closer, testing the honesty of his grief. The shadows shifted in response, dissolving and reforming until they stood like silhouettes carved from dusk. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, its presence unmistakably ancestral. It did not speak in words. Instead, it sent a pulsing heaviness through his chest, a pressure that seemed to lift his heart out of hiding. He felt the weight of invisible chains, not metal, but memory, tightening around him. Each link represented the moments he had chosen fame over loyalty, ambition over gratitude, fear over truth. His voice, once celebrated across stages, now trembled into silence. This forest did not care for talent or popularity. It cared only for the truth beneath his ribs, the truth he spent years avoiding. He whispered an apology, though he hated how small it sounded. But the spirits were unmoved. They demanded more, not words, but surrender. They pressed against his guilt until his legs gave way, and he sank to the forest floor, palms pressed into cold soil, as if he were begging the earth itself to forgive him. He felt something loosen inside him, a trembling thread unwinding from the center of his heart. Confession, not spoken, but felt, spilled through him like water breaking through stone. The forest responded with a shift in the air, its heavy silence softening, though not enough to suggest forgiveness. A narrow path began to glow faintly ahead of him, illuminated by specks of golden dust dancing like tiny flames. The spirits gave no instruction, but he understood. They would not grant him redemption easily, but they would allow him to search for the woman he had broken. Kalen rose slowly, steadying his breath as the forest dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, testing each heartbeat with its ancient patience. He walked forward with trembling steps, each one echoing like a vow. Every tree he passed seemed to whisper warnings. Every shadow he crossed seemed to measure his sincerity. The forest demanded that he leave behind the version of himself shaped by fame and deception, and step into a man willing to face the consequences of his choices. Then, as he reached the deeper center of the forest, the air shifted. A melody drifted through the trees, soft, delicate, and heartbreakingly familiar. Kalen froze where he stood, his breath stolen by disbelief, because the sound carried a rhythm he had not heard since the earliest days with her. It was Zuri's chant, the one she hummed when she crushed herbs at dawn, the one she whispered when healing the wounded, the one she sang when she believed the world still held beauty. The chant grew clearer, threading through the trees like a trail of light leading him forward. His heart pounded with hope and dread intertwined, because that melody could only mean one thing. Zuri was near, and whatever waited beyond the next cluster of trees would change the course of his soul forever. Zuri stood in the heart of the sacred clearing, surrounded by ancient stones arranged in a perfect circle, each one humming with a faint glow that pulsed like a heartbeat, buried deep beneath the earth. Mist curled around her feet, rising and falling in gentle waves as though bowing to her presence. She was no longer the quiet woman who once opened her door to a starving dreamer. She was a shape carved from strength, silence, and something older than forgiveness itself. And the moment Kalen saw her, a tremor ran through him, because he felt instantly that he was standing before the version of Zuri he had never deserved. For several breaths, he could not move. The sight of her hit him with a force he hadn't prepared for. A woman transformed by pain, but not consumed by it, softened by wisdom, but hardened by truth. Her back was straight, her palms resting lightly on the sacred stones, her eyes closed as she listened to the forest's whispers. When she finally opened them, turning to face him, the clearing seemed to shift in response, as though the entire forest waited for what would unfold between them. Kalen stepped forward slowly, each movement weighted with guilt. His throat tightened around unspoken apologies he had practiced 100 times, but suddenly felt unworthy to voice. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He tried again, and this time a trembling whisper escaped, her name. Zuri did not flinch. Her gaze held him without anger, without accusation, but with a distance so profound it made his knees weaken. It was the gaze of someone who had healed from a wound the world could not see, but who still remembered where the blade had pierced. He fell to his knees, breath shaking, words stumbling into the clearing in uneven fragments. He told her he was sorry. He told her he had lost everything he once thought he wanted. He told her he had been wrong from the moment he took her manuscript, wrong from the moment he traded her trust for applause, wrong from the moment he stepped into a world that celebrated him for a voice he did not earn. His confession spilled like water, desperate and unsteady, but Zuri listened with an expression carved from stillness. When he finished speaking, the clearing grew unbearably silent. Zuri walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps, the stones beneath her feet glowing brighter with each movement. When she was close enough for him to see the small changes in her face, lines carved from grief, tenderness deepened by solitude, she knelt beside him. Kalen bowed his head, unable to meet her eyes, but Zuri gently lifted his chin with a single finger. Her voice, when she spoke, held no trace of bitterness. It was calm, too calm, like a river that had learned to flow around every stone placed in its path. She told him the forest had reshaped her. It had stripped away the hurt, the grief, the longing for answers, and rebuilt her with a strength she never knew she possessed. She no longer held on to what he stole, because the forest had given her knowledge far older than the manuscript he betrayed her for. She no longer walked the world as the healer she once was. She walked it as someone chosen by the spirits themselves. Zuri's honesty cut deeper than any anger could. Kalen's breath faltered when he realized the truth. She had grown beyond his reach. She did not hate him. She did not need him. She did not cling to the hurt he caused. She had risen without him, and that, more than her loss, was the wound he found hardest to face. He begged again, not for her love, not for the past, but for forgiveness, the kind that could free his guilt from the prison he had built inside himself. Tears blurred his vision as he grasped at her hands, desperate for a sign that she could release him. But Zuri gently pulled her hands away, shaking her head with a softness that broke him far more than rejection. Her voice lowered, woven with truth and sorrow. She told him forgiveness was not hers to give, not anymore. The moment he crossed into the sacred forest, his fate no longer depended on her heart. It depended on the spirits who watched, the ancestors who remembered, the forest that demanded justice for every wound he had carved into the world it protected. Kalen felt the ground tilt beneath him, a cold certainty sliding into his chest. He whispered, almost afraid to ask, what the spirits would demand from him. Zuri lifted her gaze to the trees, where shadows swayed like silent witnesses, and the glowing stones around the clearing dimmed into a deep, foreboding red. She turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper, and said the words that froze the air between them. The spirits would require a sacrifice, one far heavier than apologies, far deeper than regret, and far more costly than anything he had ever paid. And the forest had already begun choosing what that sacrifice would be. The clearing shuddered, as though a sleeping giant had exhaled beneath the earth, and the air shifted into a coldness that did not belong to the forest. Kalen felt the ground tremble beneath his knees, just as ancestral spirits rose from the soil, their shapes carved in mist and moonlight, their silence sharp enough to cut straight through the soul. He tried to steady his breath, but the forest no longer allowed him the luxury of calm. The spirits gathered around him in a slow, deliberate circle, their glowing eyes reflecting the truth he had spent years running from. And as their forms solidified, he realized with a sinking dread that he was no longer a man pleading for forgiveness. He was a man standing before judgment. The first spirit stepped forward, its figure shifting like smoke caught between dawn and dusk. It lifted an arm toward him, and the forest fell away. Suddenly, Kalen stood inside a memory he had not summoned, a memory he wished he had forgotten. He saw himself performing on a stage lit with gold, his voice soaring effortlessly as the crowd erupted in adoration. But the vision expanded beyond the applause, showing the other side of the story. The communities who believed in the healing words he sang, the villagers who sought guidance from the teachings he had stolen, the hands that reached toward him with hope he never intended to honor. Faces once blurred by fame, now sharpened with heartbreaking clarity, their disappointment settling across his chest like a weight he could not shake off. Another spirit stepped forward, and the memory shifted. He saw a group of families gathered in a rural village, holding Zuri's misused teachings in their trembling hands. A healer, one who had purchased a fake copy of her stolen manuscript, attempted a ritual with no understanding of the wisdom behind it. The ritual failed spectacularly, leaving the community confused, frightened, and spiritually wounded. Kalen felt himself gasp as the consequences of his ambition revealed themselves not as abstract losses, but as real lives harmed by his stolen success. Every scream, every tear, every frightened prayer echoed through him like a chorus of accusations he could never outrun. The third spirit emerged, and its presence felt older, heavier, impossibly wise. It brought forth another memory, one he had buried deepest. It showed Zuri the morning she discovered her manuscript missing. Kalen watched his own betrayal unfold through the eyes of the woman who once trusted him. He saw her rush through her home in frantic disbelief, searching corners she had cleaned just hours before, clutching her chest as if her heart were slipping through her fingers. She sank onto the floor, her face buried in her hands, her body trembling not from rage, but from heartbreak. The sheer quiet of her pain cut through him with far more force than any scream ever could. Kalen's breath collapsed into a ragged gasp. His hands shook violently, gripping the earth as though it might anchor him from drowning in the truth. The spirits pressed closer, their energy heavy enough to make the trees bend inward, their judgment thickening the air until every inhale felt like swallowing regret. Zuri stood behind the circle, her posture calm but distant, her fate no longer tethered to the choices he made. She watched not as a victim seeking justice, but as a witness standing at the edge of a world he had to face alone. The spirits spoke, not in words, but in a pulsing force that throbbed inside his chest, demanding acknowledgement. They showed him that the fame he worshipped had been forged from the ruins of her inheritance. They made him feel the weight of every person misled by the knowledge he did not earn. They dragged forth the truth he had buried deeper than any grave. He had risen on a foundation built entirely from betrayal. Kalen bowed his head under the unbearable pressure, sweat and tears falling freely into the soil. He whispered apologies, not to win mercy, but because the force of grief overflowing through him left no other path. Yet the forest did not soften. The spirits did not waver. They had not come to soothe him. They had come to deliver the price. A sudden stillness took hold of the clearing. The spirits stepped back in unison, and the light in their eyes sharpened into something final, ancient, and absolute. The air hummed with a warning that made even the leaves fall silent. The tallest spirit lifted its hand, and the truth struck him like a silent lightning bolt. The sacrifice demanded of him was not his comfort, not his wealth, not even his pride. The spirits had decided he must give up the very gift that made him famous, and as their judgment echoed through the clearing, Kalen felt his voice, the one thing he thought he could never lose, begin to tremble on the edge of disappearance. For the first time in his life, Kalen understood that some losses were not punishments. They were pathways. The spirit's decree settled into the clearing with a chilling quiet, and the offer they placed before him was devastating in its simplicity. He could either surrender his voice, the very gift that had built his fame, shaped his identity, and carried him into a world he believed was destiny, or he could refuse and remain chained to guilt forever, a prisoner of the harm he could no longer deny. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he absorbed the weight of the choice. For a man who had spent years chasing applause, the silence pressing against him now demanded a courage he had never been forced to claim. He closed his eyes, letting the memories unravel inside him. He saw the moment he stole Zuri's manuscript, convincing himself it was harmless ambition. He heard the applause that followed, loud enough to drown out his conscience. He felt the weight of his rising fame, built on words that were not his, wisdom he did not earn, and trust he had shattered. And then he saw Zuri, standing in the clearing, her spirit resculpted by pain and healing, her strength forged from truth rather than admiration. The contrast between them carved a hollow into his chest. He knew then that if he wanted to become a man worthy of the world he had damaged, he had to let go of the version of himself that fame had created. Kalen lifted his head and met the eyes of the tallest spirit, his decision already alive in the tremble of his breath. He spoke with a quiet conviction that surprised even him. He chose to surrender. The moment the words left his lips, the air thickened, then tightened, then stilled, as though the forest itself acknowledged the depth of what he had offered. The spirits moved closer, not aggressively, but with the solemnity of a sacred ritual. Their presence wrapped around him like a cold mist, penetrating his chest and throat with a weight that felt both painful and purifying. A faint hum rose around him. It began soft, like distant wind brushing through hollow reeds, then grew into vibrations that echoed through his bones. Kalen clutched at his throat reflexively, feeling the hum shift into warmth, then into sharpness, then into an unfamiliar emptiness. His voice, once powerful enough to silence crowds, faltered. The forest's glow reflected in his eyes as he tried to speak. First a word, then a sound, then a broken whisper. What emerged was nothing like the rich, resonant tone he once carried. It was thin, fragile, barely there. He felt the loss like a tear in the fabric of who he had been. The spirits did not celebrate his sacrifice. They did not praise him. They simply stepped back, their glowing forms dimming into the soft pulse of ancestral approval. The forest shifted again, branches swaying in a wind that had not been there moments before. The mist around the clearing brightened, and from it emerged something unexpected, a warmth that wrapped around Kalen's chest, spreading through him like healing hands. The spirits had taken his voice, but they had not left him empty. In its place, they offered a gift woven from humility and responsibility, the ability to repair what his betrayal had broken. Knowledge rushed into him, not as words, but as instincts. He understood herbs he had never seen, remedies he had never studied, chants he had never learned. The wisdom Zuri once carried alone now lived quietly within him, not to elevate him, but to restore the balance his ambition had disrupted. He felt overwhelmed by both the gift and the cost. He knew this path would not lead him back to fame. It would lead him toward the people who needed truth, not performance, healing, not entertainment. He rose slowly, breath steadying as his new reality settled inside him. He felt different, not redeemed, not forgiven, but realigned. For the first time, he carried a purpose that wasn't fueled by applause or desperation. He turned toward Zuri, heart trembling with the hope that she would see the sincerity in what he had done. She watched him with a soft but distant expression, her eyes carrying both recognition and caution. She had witnessed his sacrifice, but her heart remained shaped by the scars he had left. Kalen tried to speak her name, reaching for a sound that felt familiar, comforting, necessary. But the moment he opened his mouth, he felt a jarring disconnect. The voice that emerged was thin, almost childlike, shaping her name with a trembling vulnerability that startled him. He barely recognized the sound as his own. He touched his throat, stunned by the unfamiliar tone, and looked at Zuri with rising uncertainty. The spirits had not only taken his voice, they had transformed it. And as she stepped back with a look he couldn't decipher, he realized he had no idea whether this new voice would guide him toward redemption, or deeper into the forest's final test. Kalen moved through the world like a man reborn, though carrying a silence that felt heavier than any stage he had ever stood upon. The road stretching before him was long and dust-covered, but for the first time, he did not walk seeking applause or recognition. He walked seeking repair. His voice, once a powerful instrument, had faded into a whisper too fragile for song, and yet he found that silence offered him something he had never known: honesty. In that quiet, he finally saw the work that needed to be done. Redemption would not come through words. It would come through the weight of his footsteps, the calluses on his palms, and the humility he learned to carry, like a second skin. The first village he entered greeted him with suspicion. Many remembered the fake healers who had misused Zuri's teachings, harm born from the manuscript he had stolen. Kalen felt the sting of their wary eyes, but he did not blame them. Instead, he bowed respectfully, lowering himself before the elders as a student, not a performer. When a young boy limped across the path, Kalen knelt beside him and instinctively reached for the herbs Zuri had once taught him to recognize. His movements were slow, deliberate, guided by the quiet knowledge the spirits had given him. The boy's mother watched with caution, But when her son rose minutes later, with relief softening his steps, her expression shifted from doubt to stunned gratitude. Word spread. In the next village, he carried water jars for women who had strained their backs over decades of labor. He helped repair roofs made fragile by storms, worked alongside farmers in fields where the soil had forgotten generosity, and tended to fevers that once ravaged families. The elders began inviting him to sit among them, teaching him chants meant to restore balance between body and spirit. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he assumed. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Not to him, but around him. The communities he once wounded started to breathe easier again. Every healing he offered was another stitch in the fabric of trust he had torn. Every act of service became an unspoken apology woven into the rhythm of daily life. When he walked through markets, children greeted him with smiles instead of fear. When he entered a home to offer medicine, families welcomed him without hesitation. He began to feel the subtle shift of forgiveness, not forced, not immediate, but earned through effort and sincerity. Still at night, as he lay beneath unfamiliar skies, Kalen often wondered if Zuri could ever forgive him. Her absence lingered like a soft ache that never fully faded. Though she did not walk beside him physically, her presence guided him from afar. In many villages, he found traces of her recent visits, fresh herbal mixtures, written instructions left for healers, quiet blessings carved into the soil. She was rebuilding the world he had damaged long before he arrived, moving with a purpose shaped by compassion and resilience. He followed those traces like a thread binding him back to the woman he had broken, though he dared not approach her. He knew she needed distance. He knew she needed time. And he respected the silence between them as the bridge he still hoped to cross one day. As the months passed, Kalen's reputation transformed, not into the fame he once chased, but into something quieter and far more meaningful. Communities began referring to him as the Silent Restorer, a man who repaired what had once been misled by false healers. His voice, fragile and uncertain, became unnecessary. His actions carried the weight he once tried to project through song. And though the world no longer echoed his name across radios and stages, the land itself whispered it with gentle respect. Then, one evening, as he prepared herbs beside a fire with a group of village healers, an elder approached him with worry etched deep into her features. She lowered her voice, as if fearing the trees might listen, and told him of a rising disturbance across neighboring regions. Someone, dangerous, cunning, relentless, had begun searching for Zuri's manuscript again. This time not for fame, not for songs, but for control. The knowledge inside that manuscript, when twisted by the wrong hands, could bend desperate people into followers, turning sacred teachings into manipulation. And the rumors carried one chilling certainty. Whoever sought the manuscript believed Kalen still knew where Zuri had hidden the original truths. A cold tremor spread through his chest. The elders' voices lowered to whispers as they revealed sightings of strangers asking questions, offering bribes, threatening silence, leaving unease in every village they passed. Some believed the manuscript held power capable of shaping entire regions. Others feared it contained secrets that should never be revived. But all agreed on one truth. Zuri was no longer safe. Kalen's stomach tightened with dread. He had spent months repairing the damage he inflicted, only to realize the danger he introduced into the world was rising again, with renewed hunger. And he knew, with painful clarity, that destiny was circling back toward him, demanding a responsibility he could no longer run from. Just as the fire crackled softly beside him, another healer rushed in with breathless urgency. Someone had been spotted entering the sacred forest, carrying questions Kalen feared to answer. The peace he worked so hard to build trembled in the balance, and he knew the past he tried to heal was no longer behind him. It was coming straight toward him. Danger arrived not with thunder or shouts, but with a quiet tension that crept through the forest like a warning whispered by the wind. Zuri sensed it first, the shift in the air, the tremble beneath the roots, the sudden hush of birds whose songs vanished as if swallowed by an unseen force. And when she emerged from the inner clearing to find Kalen waiting at the edge of the sacred grove, breathless and shaken, she understood instantly that the past they had tried to walk separately from was returning to claim what neither of them could ignore. For the first time since the betrayal that tore their lives apart, fate placed them side by side, bound not by sorrow, but by a threat far greater than either one of them. Kalen explained everything in his fragile, trembling voice. The villages whispering of strangers seeking the manuscript, the men offering bribes and stirring fear, the shadowy figure seen entering the forest. Zuri listened with a stillness shaped by wisdom and caution. She did not flinch when he admitted his guilt in attracting danger. Instead, she observed him with eyes that had already learned to separate regret from growth. But when he spoke of the threat moving closer every day, she felt a shift with, not for the manuscripts entrusted to. They walked deep, the path illuminated through the canopy. For the first time since their separation, they moved in rhythm, Zuri with her calm, measured steps, Kalen with his quiet determination. The spirits murmured around them, their presence thick but approving, as though they recognized the necessity of unity. When they reached the hidden chamber where the original manuscript rested, sealed and untouched since Zuri surrendered it to the forest for safekeeping, she placed her hand on the bark-covered entrance and whispered an ancestral chant. The air parted, revealing the sacred scrolls glowing with soft golden light. Kalen stepped back in reverence, touched by humility he had never known before. He watched Zuri lift the manuscript with care, her palms steady, her spirit anchored. There was no fear in her eyes, only purpose. He realized then that she no longer protected the manuscript for herself. She protected it for everyone harmed by its misuse, everyone healed by its wisdom, everyone searching for hope in a world often ruled by chaos. And in that moment, he saw the depth of who she had become, someone shaped not by loss, but by the strength to rise from it. The danger found them by dusk. Branches cracked in the distance. Shadows moved where no shadows should have been. The forest shifted into wariness, its spirits thickening the air like a warning drumbeat. Zuri's breath steadied instantly, her instincts sharpened. Kalen positioned himself beside her, not as a shield, but as a man ready to stand between harm and the truth he had finally learned to honor. When the intruders stepped into the clearing, three cloaked figures whose intentions dripped like poisoned honey, the forest stiffened, recognizing the threat before words were even spoken. Zuri spoke with calm authority, her voice steady as stone. She warned them that the manuscript was not a tool, not a trophy, not a ladder to power. It was knowledge that demanded reverence, discipline, and humility. They ignored her, their eyes burning with greed masked as purpose. But before they could move forward, Kalen stepped between them and Zuri, his new fragile voice trembling as he offered himself instead. He told them he knew the weight of misusing wisdom, that he had lived its consequences and rebuilt himself through the pain it caused. He told them if they wanted a path to power, they would walk over him first, but the manuscript would never be theirs. The forest responded. The spirits rose once more, their presence forming an invisible barrier around Zuri and Kalen. The intruders faltered, their courage thinning beneath ancestral judgment. Moments later, they vanished into the shadows, fleeing from a power they could not control. When the clearing finally stilled, the forest exhaled, releasing a calm that washed over them like a blessing. Zuri turned toward Kalen. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the sincerity in his trembling stance, the weight he carried not for himself but for her, and the legacy she protected. He, Izaitu, had chosen sacrifice over safety, humility over pride, truth over his once precious voice. She felt something inside her soften her, an ache she thought was permanently sealed. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of something tender rising again through the ashes. In the days that followed, they worked as a team, restoring protective seals, strengthening the pathways between villages, teaching communities how to guard sacred wisdom. Slowly, carefully, their rhythms began aligning again. At night, when the forest quieted, they sat near the glowing stones, sharing stories of what they had learned, what they had lost, and what they hoped to rebuild. In those moments, the silence between them transformed into something gentle, something patient, something alive. But when the danger finally faded and the forest returned to peace, a different question rose in Zuri's heart, one she could no longer ignore. She looked at Kalen, standing quietly beneath the trees, waiting with a hope he dared not voice, and she realized the truth she must face alone. Would she allow him into her heart again, or let fate guide them in separate directions forever? If this story pulled you in, don't let the journey end here. Your One Like helps these emotional stories reach someone who may need them today. Tell me in the comments, should Zuri forgive him or walk away forever? Your voice shapes the next chapter. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next life-changing story. Stay with us. Every week, a new tale that touches the heart and stirs the soul.